Imagine the world 100 years ago.
Rocky Point, Long Island, 1930.
Empires are crumbling, maps are being redrawn. Traditions are facing the challenges of new times. Now imagine that you are a Muslim in this chaos. Your cities are engulfed in war. Your culture is disappearing before your eyes. Everything that was familiar and dear is suddenly under threat. For centuries, the Muslim world was the engine of progress. Scientists, rulers, warriors, thinkers. They shaped science, art, architecture, and entire empires. But something went wrong. In the early 20th century, the Islamic world found itself at a crossroads. World wars, colonization, and the collapse of great states threw once prosperous nations to the brink of survival. So what happened? How did a world that was once synonymous with the greatness end up in the shadows? At this time, the world was facing global changes. The Russian Revolution of 1917 changed the political map of Eastern Europe. And just a few years later, the Ottoman Empire, the last stronghold of the Caliphate, collapsed. Muslims around the world were on the brink, with their communities either being destroyed or assimilated. But the question is, how did they survive? What helped them maintain their identity despite all these tragedies? And here is where things get interesting. When the Muslim world seemed fragmented and weak, people emerged who were ready to challenge this chaos. One of these people was Sheikh al-Rashid Ibrahim, a Tatar by origin, originally from the Russian Empire. He decided to travel around the world to see with his own eyes and document what was happening to Muslims. What if I told you that a book written over 100 years ago reveals unknown facts about the spread of Islam in Japan and Central Asia? This book has become a real treasure, a unique look at a turning point in the history of the Islamic world. Dr. Salih al-Samiroy edited and translated this work from Ottoman into Arabic and French. Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani distilled the essentials, making the book more accessible. I went further and shortened the material even more for this video, leaving only the most interesting parts. This book is not available in Russian or English. This is an exclusive chance to learn history that is inaccessible to millions. Seriously, who doesn't want to be a part of an elite club of history buffs? A unique opportunity to immerse yourself in the lives of Muslims a century ago. If you miss this video, you risk missing out on one of the most exciting journeys in the history of Islam. Sheikh al-Rashid Ibrahim saw a lot, from the deprivation of Muslims' religious freedoms in Tsarist Russia to amazing encounters with preachers in Japan, from poor neighborhoods in China to luxurious palaces in the Ottoman Empire. Every step of his journey revealed more and more new, sometimes shocking facts. How did Islam find its way to distant Japan? What did Russian Muslims experience under the pressure of Tsarist Russia? And what lessons can we learn from their story today? This is about a little-known eminent Islamic scholar named al-Rashid al-Kurmi, who played an important role in preserving the knowledge and spiritual heritage of Muslims at a critical time in history. This man, originally from Crimea and living a century ago, dedicated his life to studying and supporting Muslim communities around the world. Crimea is the region to which the Sheikh belonged, so he is called al-Kurmi in Arabic. Sheikh Abd al-Kurmi wrote a huge book when he left his homeland of Russia during the persecution of Muslims. He traveled to several countries before being invited to Japan, recording his observations on the journey from Siberia to Japan, and a huge number of countries for that time. Now, that's a tour that would impress even the most seasoned traveler. He practically crossed Asia from west to east. It's basically two large volumes, which we'll briefly cover in this video.
What made the Sheikh go on a journey?
Abd-Rashid Ibrahim al-Kurmi was a Tatar from the Russian Federation, originally from Crimea. He was born in 1846 and lived for almost a century. He studied religious sciences in his homeland and then, as a young man, went to Hijaz, where he studied Sharia sciences and mastered Arabic. He also emigrated to Turkey and called on Muslims in Russia to move there. According to him, about 7,000 Turkic Muslims moved to Turkey since the situation in Russia was difficult, especially after the Bolsheviks came to power. In 1892, al-Rashid took the post of chairman of the Russian Muslim Council. In 1897, he began a 3-year journey from Istanbul, covering Egypt, Hijaz, Palestine, Italy, Austria, parts of Europe, as well as India, Turkestan and China. This was his first major journey. Returning to his homeland in Siberia in 1904, he was persecuted and imprisoned in Odessa. It seems that the life of the Sheikh was full of not only historical discoveries, but also action. That same year he was also arrested in Istanbul at the request of Russia, and his homeland persecuted him even in the Ottoman Empire. He founded a printing house in St. Petersburg, and in 1908-1909 he made his journey to East Asia and published it in a book. Instagram did not exist then at that time. Traveling was not as easy as it is now. No internet, no online maps. This is the huge book in 2 volumes that was abridged by Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani and presented in the form of this small book. This book, written in 1909, describes the situation of Muslims as he saw it and includes many important events, including tragic ones, which show the state of the Muslims. In 1911, al-Rashid went to Libya and fought against the Italians with Umar Mukhtar. Then, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, when the communists seized power and established an atheistic regime, he moved to Turkey. In 1934, he went to Japan, which was an important stage in his life. There he became one of the founders of Muslim community, built a mosque in Tokyo and became its imam in 1938. He died in 1944 in Tokyo and was buried in the cemetery of the Tatar Turks Muslims. It is important to note that there was a Muslim community of Tatar Turks in Japan, especially in Tokyo. Sheikh Abd died in the midst of World War II, when Japan was involved in the war. In a book written in 1909, his sympathies for Japan are reflected in many aspects. He also wrote several other books and publications, but we will not go into them now. The Sheikh had gone on a voluntary journey before he was invited to Japan and had founded a Muslim community. He says elsewhere in the book that this journey was an obligation for Muslims. In his view, it was the duty of learned Muslims and scholars to go to Muslim lands and preach there, as Islam had become weakly practiced and there was much ignorance. The Sheikh believed that scholars had to open the eyes of Muslims to the reality and what was happening around them, especially in places where Islam and the search for Sharia knowledge still existed. In those days, before television and radio, there was no media, so books, lectures and newspapers were perhaps the only way for people, especially ordinary non-scholars, to learn about what was happening in other parts of the world and the situation of Muslim communities. He says,
I tightened the belt of determination on my stomach, took my staff in my hand, bade farewell to my children, and set out.
He walked and sometimes rode on horseback. His journey was difficult. I wonder how he did it without Google Maps. Did he have a compass, or did he follow the stars, or were they the maps of the time? And so he walked for thousands of kilometers. First through the city of Samarkand, where he mentions a Quran attributed to Osman. May Allah be pleased with him. This Quran is still known and is said to be sometimes displayed in the Islamic Museum in Istanbul. Some doubt that this is the same Quran of Osman, and Sheikh Abd is inclined to believe that it is indeed not the same Quran. He also mentions that he walked 1000 kilometers on a riding animal until he reached the city of Almaty in Central Asia. The author of the book comments that this was at a time when cars already existed, although they were just beginning to appear and trains were already there too. And also ships, but the Sheikh, may Allah be pleased with him, was poor. So he traveled on a riding animal and sometimes even walked. The passages I will mention are not in chronological order, as the purpose is to highlight key moments and important episodes, not simply to recount the journey in order. For example, we will jump straight to Japan, although he was not yet reached it. He deplored the situation of Muslims in Japan and the Japanese in general, pointing out that there was a lot of Christianization. European, Russian, and American missionaries were present all over Japan, especially in Tokyo. One could say that the missionaries felt at home in Tokyo, only without the granny pies. For example, he mentions a Russian missionary who preached Christianity in Tokyo for 45 years and converted 300,000 people to Christianity. He also says that the missionaries printed a book called Muhammad, peace be upon him, which was full of false accusations and lies about the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. 5 million copies of this book were printed, imagine, in Japan, where people had never even heard of Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. This was done to distort the image of Islam and to hinder the Islamic preaching in Japan. He also talks about the Japanese military ethic in another passage, which was quite unusual. For example, when there was a war between Japan and Russia, and there were several such wars, the Japanese captured 10,000 Russian soldiers, among whom were 750 Muslims. The Japanese treated them very well. First, they asked, "Who among you can read and write?" From the prisoners came 15 scholars. They were told, "Choose one of you to be the imam and muezzin in the prisoner of war camp. The rest will stay with you to teach you your religion." They were given everything they needed to learn their faith. They were told, "You are now our guests, but you are required to learn to read and write for 5 hours a day." That is also interesting, as if it were a camp with elements of academic recreation. The Japanese showed them great respect. This is surprising because there are other stories of Japanese cruelty to Chinese prisoners of war and other peoples during World War II. Perhaps this was a special attitude towards Muslims or an attempt to improve his relations with them. Allah knows best. The Sheikh, may Allah have mercy on him, admired Japan, and this admiration appears in several places in the book. In one of the remarkable moments, he narrates that he met a Buddhist priest who was fair. During their conversation, the Buddhist said to Sheikh al-Rashid, "Our book mentions the name of Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him." Sheikh al-Rashid was very happy to hear this and decided to read a book that mentioned the name of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. The Buddhist said,
I cannot deny the prophethood of Muhammad.
although there may have been contact between Muslims and Buddhists, and they were called Sumanites. They were the first to introduce innovations. For example, Jahm ibn Safwan founded one of the sects from which the Jahmid sect later emerged, and various philosophical sects began to form, causing problems in faith and divisions among Muslims. It is possible that the beginning of Jahm's journey was in his encounter with these Sumanites, who were called atheists because Buddhism doesn't recognize the existence of a creator. Contact between Muslims and Buddhists took place at that time. Buddhism even spread to Iraq when the lands of Persia, which were then Zoroastrian, were conquered. Zoroastrianism, by the way, which was widespread in China, also influenced the beliefs and customs of Muslims, and sometimes it was difficult to distinguish who was Muslim and who was Zoroastrian. Some of them considered themselves Muslims, but had mixed beliefs. However, I am not aware of any mention of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, in Buddhist texts, because Buddhists do not claim to have holy books, and Buddha is not considered a prophet. Sheikh Abd rejects the idea that Buddha was a prophet. He says that this is a matter of dispute, and no one has come to a final conclusion. This topic has been discussed for a long time, and even in early Islamic books such as al-Biruni, Buddha was called the author of innovations. It is said that in some Hindu Vedas there is a mention of the qualities of a person who will appear in the lands of the Arabs and whose qualities are the same as the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. Apologist Zakir Naik mentioned this in his lectures. One of the interesting things that the Sheikh mentioned was a Russian Jew named Kharkov, I don't know this name or surname, but is mentioned in the book, who converted to Islam. If social media had existed back then, Kharkov's story would have gotten millions of likes and comments. And that was surprising because Jews, since the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, have been among the least likely to convert to Islam. Then he mentions that in Russia, over 68,000 people converted to Islam in 5 years, which was very worrying for the Russians during the Tsarist era. One of the interesting things that the Sheikh mentioned was a young Russian man who, despite all the difficulties, openly declared his conversion to Islam, defying the government. This was before the Bolshevik Revolution, when Islam was already under pressure in the Soviet Union. The Sheikh also tells of his visit to a Muslim school in China, where the teachers and sheikhs spoke Arabic with a strong accent, which was quite comical. Imagine how the Arabs listening to them might ask, "Are you sure you speak our language?" And so the Sheikh expresses his regret at the state of the Muslims in China, although they had ancient Arabic manuscripts, but no one could read them. Even the teachers, who were supposed to be sheikhs, could hardly understand what was written in them, and their knowledge of the language was very poor. In several places in the book, he mentions the weak state of Islam in China in general. He then visited the Muslims in northern China and found the same ignorance as in the rest of China. He saw students who studied grammar, morphology, and fiqh, but didn't know Arabic. He blamed the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, asking, "Why do you not send scholars to teach these people?" At the time, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, weakened by internal problems and external threats, which greatly limited its ability and resources to support Muslims beyond its borders. Of course, the Ottoman Empire was then experiencing its worst times. The Sheikh also mentions Korea, which was an unexpected but interesting topic of discussion. He says that the Koreans worked as porters and went to China and Russia to work there. When he spoke to them, they said, "We seem to be a people doomed to misery and suffering." Sheikh Salim comments here, "Subhanallah, look at how the situation of Korea has changed from 1909 to the present day, how they have completely changed their situation." Sheikh Abd also mentions that he took some photographs of the Korean porters, but they were lost because he had mailed them to his family. But according to him, someone from the post office stole them. I wonder if the post office can still return these photos after 100 years. He regrets this, because cameras were rare in those days, and these pictures could have become valuable historical documents. Unfortunately, they were lost and did not reach us. There is another point where he talks about how he walked to Tokyo, praying to Allah to give him the strength to walk. And he walked 35 kilometers in 8 hours. Also, an important point is that he talks about the first Muslim who spread Islam in Japan. He was an Egyptian sheikh who was an officer and fought in the Mahdist wars in Sudan. I don't know if you have heard of the Mahdist movement, but it still exists. The Mahdi considered himself the Mahdi, and fought against the British, winning several unexpected victories. The Mahdi died, but his followers, who still exist and have a political party, consider him the Mahdi, although he died and Isa, Jesus, did not come in his time, but they explain it in their own way. Anyway, this officer named Ahmad Fadli Bek was part of the Mahdi's army against the British. He was zealous Muslim, spoke English and French fluently. He left Egypt around 1904 and went to Japan. At that time there was not such openness as there is now. Travel was difficult because there were no planes and you had to travel by ship and train. He arrived in Japan, a remote place that Muslims did not even think about. Moreover, Japan was then a very closed country, and this officer went to Japan during this difficult period. Married a Japanese woman, which was unusual since the Japanese rarely allowed foreigners to marry their women. Apparently, this was one of the first cases in which international relations took on such a personal character. Then he returned to Egypt with his wife and her mother, and they accepted Islam. Then he returned to Japan again, began to preach Islam, founded an Islamic center there, and lectured at Waseda University on Muslims. He played a big role in spreading Islam in Japan. It can be said that perhaps all those who embraced Islam through these institutions and communities owe their reward in part to this officer Fadli. All his merit before Allah for all Muslims in Japan is written to his account, Insha'Allah. Sheikh Abd arrived in Japan and began interacting with the people. Newspapers began writing about him, and he began talking about Japanese food, that they only had fish, that they did not know bread or meat, only fish and rice. He also mentioned that the Japanese were physically strong. He also talked about the prisons, that they had schools, parks and factories where the prisoners worked. It seems that Japanese prisons at that time could compete with sanatoriums with their order and comfort. He even said that he envied the prisoners for how well they lived. He mainly talked about the positive aspects of Japan. He also spoke with admiration about the Japanese people's commitment to their language and pride in it. He mentioned meeting a Japanese professor named Takada and criticized the Japanese elites who admired European culture. They wanted to change Japanese characters and change their culture, but the conservatives remained true to their culture. This reminds us of what happened in Turkey when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk changed the script from Arabic to Latin. The Sheikh, being very impressed by Japan, says that if it were not for the idols that the Japanese worship, he would say that they are Muslims. The Japanese had the potential to become good Muslims if it were not for their wooden friends that they idolized. The Sheikh says that they have good morals. Of course, this is an exaggeration in my opinion, because they worship not only idols, but also spirits, which are actually shaitans. Their religion was polytheism, and even if their morals were better than those of the Europeans, this doesn't make them closer to Islam than, for example, Christians, because the problem here is faith. The Sheikh also mentions that the Japanese were very surprised by the idea of polygamy in Islam. They rejected this principle outright, and he told them, "Don't judge Islam by one issue. If you don't like polygamy, no one forces you to practice polygamy after accepting Islam." An Egyptian officer, Ahmad Fadli, was given a lecture at Waseda University in Tokyo. He spoke for 3 hours straight about Islam to a large audience of about 2,000 people. The students listened to him with great interest, as if they were hearing about this religion for the first time. It was the beginning of an interest in this distant and unknown religion which they had never heard of. The Sheikh also mentions the Hijaz Railway, which was inextricably linked to the Ottoman Empire, whose capital was Istanbul, present-day Turkey. Construction of the road began in 1900 by decree of Sultan Abdul Hamid II and was intended to connect the capital of the empire with the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, facilitating pilgrimage and strengthening control over remote provinces. The road significantly reduced the travel time of pilgrims, reducing it from several weeks to a few days. In addition, it contributed to the economic development of the regions through which it passed and facilitated the transportation of troops and goods. However, despite its enormous importance, the road was destroyed during the Arab Revolt led by Sharif Hussein. The Sheikh was deeply saddened by the event and wondered whether it was sabotaged by foreign powers. The destruction of the road remains one of the strangest and most tragic events in the history of the region. On the next page, the Sheikh relates that one of the Japanese warriors presented Sheikh al-Rashid with his sword, telling him,
I ask you to hand over this sword, with which I cut off the heads of enemies, to Sharif Hussein in Mecca, because he is from the family of the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him.
This gift was a profound sign of respect and a symbolic act showing that even people from distant and different cultures recognized the importance of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. The sword represented valor and honor, especially for the samurai, and its delivery emphasized the spirit of respect for the Prophet. Sheikh Abd says that it was very difficult for him to carry this sword and go through all these countries, because it was very difficult and illegal in some countries. It seems that the samurai knew how to give a gift that no one would forget. Now the second part of the book. As I said, it consists of two huge volumes, each of 500 pages. In the second part, he talks about his journey to Korea, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, India, Hijaz, Damascus, and Beirut, when he returned to the Arab lands. As I said, this is not his only and not his first journey. He traveled to these countries several times. Now let's start with Korea. One of the interesting things he mentions is that when he would enter Korean homes, he would find that there were no women. The Sheikh would ask, "Where are your women?" They would say, "They are in the women's part of the house." Women in the women's part of the house? That's probably the only place where the feminists haven't gotten to yet. They were very conservative. The women would wear the hijab and not mix with the men. Notice how they were then and what the situation is now. Korea, especially South Korea, is now completely open to the West, and the women there live like in the West, whereas previously they were very modest and well-mannered. Then the Sheikh talks about the plight of Korea, which is honestly sad and depressing. He says that he found many drunks among the Koreans, while in Japan he has not seen a single drunk. The Sheikh was very disappointed with the cultural backwardness of Korea as a whole, although it was not yet divided into North and South. It was in the 1950s after World War II, when the capitalist American camp and the socialist Soviet camp divided Korea. And it's still divided. However, according to him, Korea was a dead nation, a very bad one. Seoul, which has now become more beautiful than many European capitals, was then a very backward city, and there were no buildings higher than one floor. Who would have thought that a city with almost no buildings would become the technological capital of the world in a few decades? It is noteworthy that the areas occupied by Japan, the Japanese occupation lasted 35 years, were the best. Perhaps this is another compliment from Sheikh Abd to Japan, which he loved. As far as I know, Japan treated Korea very cruelly and oppressed the Koreans. By the way, it was not a direct occupation, but the appointment of a ruler close to Japan. Korea has always been very weak and was fought over by either the Chinese Empire or the Japanese Empire, which was once stronger than China. The Sheikh sums it up by saying that the Koreans have no hope left, and they themselves admit that they have no future. Well, the Sheikh clearly underestimated them. Look at them now. Ramen and Samsung. The future of the Koreans seems bleak to him. He says that he spent a week traveling around Korea and did not see any hope for the future. He suggests that the name Korea may disappear from memory in the future, and the country may become a Japanese province. This of course did not happen. Korea freed itself from the Japanese and it's now practically competing with the Japan in industry and technology. Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani says that Sheikh al-Rashid was wrong in his assumptions and Korea has made great strides in 60 years. It is worth noting that Korea did not rise immediately. It began its journey after World War II, and we must not forget that America gave it great opportunities for this development in order to keep it under its control. Even North Korea, which has also developed and become a strong nuclear power, could not have achieved this without the help of China, which supports it and transfers technology. The book also talks about the Christianization of Korea, and Sheikh Abd laments that the number of Christians in Korea has exceeded 1 million. It's all under the protection of foreign consuls. The Sheikh also mentions the phenomenon of suicides in Japan, which also caught his attention. And the author comments that this continues to this day. The Sheikh then talks about Manchuria, which is now part of China in the north of the country. Japan occupied it first among the Chinese territories, and then took over parts of Russia and took Korea, as we have already said. This was before World War II. The Sheikh went to Manchuria and was shocked by the level of ignorance of the Muslims there. They barely knew Arabic. Even the Imam who led the prayer could barely recite al-Fatiha correctly. He was amazed that the Chinese there believed that Islam was brought to these lands by the companion Sa'd ibn Abu Waqqas, and Sheikh Abd tried to explain to them that this was not true, but they did not believe him. The book spends many pages describing the weak state of the Muslims in China and how Zoroastrianism spread among them to such an extent that they adopted all their customs, and it became difficult to distinguish a Muslim from a Zoroastrian in China. The Sheikh described this as a depressing phenomenon. He also mentions that Muslims from Medina and Mecca would come to China and unfortunately go to brothels. Some of them would enter into temporary marriages, which was shocking news to him. Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani comments that even after a century, this problem has not disappeared. We are not talking about those who came from Mecca or Medina or from Saudi Arabia. We are talking about people from Arab countries, many of whom still go to East Asian countries like Thailand and the Philippines, which are known for their reputation for prostitution. Some Arabs go there for this purpose. For example, in Bangkok, Thailand, on a street known as Arab Street, there are Arab restaurants and a small mosque, and as some say, prostitution is rarely noticeable there. It's depressing because instead of Muslims going there for dawah, they come for that purpose. And it's sad that instead of a street where Muslims can preach, support Islam, offer halal food and have a mosque, that street also has nightclubs, hookah bars, and unfortunately prostitution. It is important to understand that I am not saying that all Arabs or most of them are like this, but this is a reputation that exists, and if you go to these countries and talk to the locals, you will hear that they really think this way about a large part of the Arab tourists. We should also not forget that many Europeans and Westerns go there for the same purpose. DW from Germany also made a documentary this year about Germans who go to Thailand to have sex with minors, who are considered children by their laws, and it is a crime. After they made this film, a few months later, they made another film because the Thai authorities saw that this film was scandalous and was hurting their tourism. Since Thailand is one of the leading tourist countries in the world, Thailand immediately took action to close down many of the establishments involved in such activities, and DW made another part of this topic. Now we come to the dialogue between Sheikh Abd and a Russian monk in China. The Russian monk who was a missionary said that in 20-25 years they were able to convert 1200 people to Christianity. The Sheikh commented that this was very little for China and added that none of them were Muslims. He said that during wars and famines they bought children from poor parents for small amounts, $50 or $60, and raised them in the monastery at their own. But the main thing is that they were not able to buy a single child from Muslims, despite the fact that Muslims were far from Islam. However, they still adhered to their religion more than the followers of other faiths. The Sheikh also talks about the joy of Chinese Muslim children when they see a Muslim. Every time he passed by, the children would gather around him and greet him with respect. It seems like the Sheikh was a real star of his time for them, without TikTok. Another interesting point is about the poverty of the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula region, the Persian Gulf. Back then, subhanallah. This was before oil. The Sheikh shouted at him, thinking that he was an Arab when he saw his clothes, and said to him,
"You come here to beg."
This was 100 years ago. Sheikh al-Rashid controlled his anger and explained to him that he was not an Arab, but from Russia, and that he was not a beggar, but a scholar who had come to teach and preach Islam. After that, a pleasant conversation began between them. The Sheikh al-Rashid turned the conversation around and said to the Chinese Sheikh, "You 70-60 million Muslims, especially in East Turkestan, which is now known as the Uyghur area, and other areas, have almost forgotten Islam, forgotten the Arabic language. Your customs have become Zoroastrian, and you have no political role in your countries." Unfortunately, the Chinese Sheikh agreed with this. In another place, the Sheikh mentions that the history of the Muslims in China is not documented and is lost. They don't have any records of their history, and this is the result of ignorance among them. The Europeans have also distorted their history a lot. The Sheikh says that when the Europeans, especially the Germans, entered Beijing in the early 20th century, they looted the imperial palace and stole some Islamic relics. Among them was the historical observatory and many other things that belonged to Muslims. The Sheikh mentions several times the barbarity of the Europeans and their cruelty in wars. The Sheikh clearly disliked Europeans and sympathized with the Japanese and other Easterners, despite the fact that not one of them were Muslims. Perhaps it was just because the Japanese make good tea. What also caught my attention was that when the Ottoman Caliph sent Sheikh Ali Reza Effendi to teach Muslims in China, he revived the tradition of praying for the Caliph on the pulpit, which had been practiced during the time of the Abbasids and other rulers. The Muslims of China began praying for Sultan Muhammad Khan, who came to power after Sultan Abdul Hamid. It is also noteworthy that one rich man named Abdullah Fakir, who was considered the founder of the city of Hong Kong, played a major role in the creation of the infrastructure of this city, although his last name was Fakir, meaning poor. He was very rich and founded the water and electricity networks in the city. It seems that his last name was the only poor aspect of his life. He also created electric trams and donated them to the city. This is really amazing, and even Sheikh Salim was amazed to hear about this man, who was not known to many and whose name is not documented in history. The Sheikh also discusses the problem of mistrust in himself and overtrust in Europeans, as well as an inferiority complex when he met an Iranian Sheikh who lamented that Eastern nations generally trust Europeans more than they deserve. For example, the Ottoman government invited a German officer to reform the army during the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid. Although Germany was careful that the Ottoman army did not surpass the German one, the Sheikh notes that in every Eastern country, including Iran and India, the people and rulers placed excessive trust in European advisors and allowed them to rule, often trusting their opinions more than their own experts. Sheikh Abd also made another journey from 1897 to 1900. Sometimes he walked, sometimes he rode camels or horses, and at another times he used steamboats and trains. In today's context, his route would be perfect for a travel vlog. The total distance he traveled was 43,000 kilometers. He went from Istanbul to Egypt, Hijaz, Syria, Palestine, then to Europe and back to East Asia, Bukhara, Turkestan and China, and then back to Siberia again. It was a huge journey, and he did it all to study the condition of the Muslims. However, despite all this, nothing was written about it. The Sheikh greatly regretted that he did not have the means and technical skills to document or draw what he saw. There were no cameras before, but travelers drew, and thanks to these drawings and old books and manuscripts, we have preserved an idea of the life of other peoples. The Sheikh also spoke about his journey to Singapore, where he met a Tunisian named Abu Bakr, who lived in Singapore. In those days, Singapore was a backward place, not like it is now. It is a city with skyscrapers now, but back then, the most you could see was a hut with leaves and a few trees. This man took it upon himself to spread the love of the Caliph Muhammad Rashid, who was later found to be a corrupt ruler and was not really a caliph in the true sense of the word. He was more of a figurehead sultan, as we have said, and the real power was wielded by the Freemasons. However, the Muslims of that time in Singapore and another remote areas, like Sumatra and Java in Indonesia, still saw the caliph as their last hope and tied their hearts to the caliphate. Sheikh Abd also expressed disappointment with Sultan Abdul Hamid, and Sheikh Salih al-Samarkandi notes in his study of the book that even Sheikh Abd was unfair to him, as were many others who later regretted their opinions. It is easy to judge until history sets the record straight. Sheikh Abd died in 1944, 30 years after the overthrow of Sultan Abdul Hamid. He probably saw the Ottoman state crumble and fall, and the Kemalists come to power and destroy the caliphate. The book was written in 1909, and we don't know what his attitude was to these events, but he died a few years before the emergence of Israel. The Sheikh also visited India and met Muslims there. He mentioned meeting an Egyptian imam who led the Muslims in prayer, but did not say much good about him. Dr. Samarkand notes that Sheikh Abd neglected to mention Imam Ahmad Musa al-Manufi, who deserved praise for his role in protecting and teaching the Muslims of India their religion. Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani also notes that Sheikh Abd must have been amazed at the courage of the Egyptian Imam who left his homeland in 1909, leaving his family behind to teach the Muslims of India their faith. This was certainly commendable, and in contrast to many other Muslims who were not active. The Sheikh went there on his own initiative, not being sent by any colonial powers, which were sending hundreds, if not thousands, of missionaries to India at the time. Sheikh Abd also notes that many Muslims still believed that their lives were tied to the Ottomans and saw Turkey as their only refuge. Unfortunately, however, the Turks no longer cared about religion. Among the Ottoman consuls who came to them, there was not a single one who prayed or fasted, and they hid their religion, embarrassed to be Muslims, and wore hats instead of the Ottoman fez. This was indeed the case, and the Ottoman Empire was in its last and weakest days. The Ottomans were embarrassed to be Muslims and Arabs, preferring to identify themselves as Europeans. It would be as if the Janissaries decided that tea was best enjoyed with a baguette. The Sheikh also mentions the worship of cows and stones in India, as well as his disappointment with the Japanese who worship idols. He says that blindness makes many Indians worship cows and stones. However, he points out that while the Japanese were civilized and intelligent and may soon give up their idolatry and become Muslims, India was very backward despite their worship of idols and cows. The Sheikh also talks about the British colonial oppression of India. Although this is a well-known topic, he details the injustice and cruelty of British colonial rule, especially in India. He criticizes the Europeans for their savagery and inhumanity, but makes no mention of the atrocities committed by the Japanese during their occupation of China, Manchuria and Korea. Probably it's Japanese tea again. He sees something positive in the fact that many people, despite the weakness of Muslims and their states, embrace Islam, be it Indian Zoroastrians, European educated people or African jungle dwellers. He is surprised that despite all these difficulties, Islam attracts many people. Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani adds that in 1909 there was no media and Muslims lived at a significant disadvantage. However, Islam is now spread in various languages through channels and websites, and despite the absence of a caliphate, the Islamic mission today is perhaps even more successful in some ways. Sheikh Abd foresaw the future and suggested that Muslims unite with the Hindus in India to expel the British. This is what happened in 1948 when the Hindus united with the Muslims and expelled the British. The Sheikh also suggested that the Japanese expel the Dutch from Indonesia and take control of these islands, seeing Japan as a more civilized and just power. Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani notes that Sheikh Abd foresaw the future since Japan did participate in the liberation of Indonesia from the Dutch and invested heavily in its development. However, Sheikh Salim stresses that all colonial powers, including Japan, were oppressors and invaders. Sheikh Abd also tells how he saw two small war boats raising the Ottoman flag and how the Muslim pilgrims on board these vessels began to weep and pray for the Sultan, believing that this was the last symbol of their hope. Despite the weakness of the Caliphate and its fall, Muslims in India and China still saw it as their last hope. Sheikh Abd concludes by telling of his visit to Damascus, Beirut and the Hijaz. These stories are not particularly important, but the Sheikh mentions how he met a Jew from Aleppo in China, who was dressed as an Ottoman scholar, but turned out to be a Jew. This Jew lamented that the Muslims had lost their religious zeal, and told Sheikh Abd that if the Muslims had retained their religious zeal, the mosque attributed to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas in China would not have been in such a sad state. The Sheikh was astonished by this remark and did not know what to say in response. Sheikh Salim al-Qahtani concludes by noting that although we now live in divided states, many of which have tyrants who are worse than the last Ottoman sultans, it is likely that the Islamic call is better now than it was at that time, or perhaps not. Sheikh Abd devoted his entire life and efforts to documenting the state of the Muslims of that time, and his services should not be forgotten.